Okay, let's unpack this. When you look at the history of Honduras through the lens of the sources you shared, you see this incredible place just bursting with natural richness, jade green waters, ancient knowledge.
It really is. The PDF you've provided certainly paints that vibrant picture right from the start.
Yeah.
But then, almost immediately, the same material layers that beauty with, well, a really tough history. Profound instability, cycles of violence, poverty.
It's a stark contrast, isn't it?
A powerful one, yeah.
Yeah,
Laid right out in the source.
absolutely. And our mission in this deep dive, really guided by the specific history you shared, is to try and sink our teeth into those complex layers. We're going to distill the most important nuggets, connect the dots between the past and the present, and help you understand what this source reveals about Honduras, from its ancient roots right up to the challenges today.
And it's a massive sweep of time. We're talking about millennia.
Right.
We'll start with the earliest people, trace the dramatic arrival of the Spanish, explore colonial rule, the bumpy road to independence.
And then into the modern era.
Yeah, then we move into the turbulent modern republic, diving into political shifts, economic struggles, social issues, culture, plus the impact of things like natural disasters, migration, and how external forces have played such a huge role.
It's quite the journey laid out here. And what's fascinating right away are these little details that kind of ground us.
Like what?
Like the possibility the name Honduras comes from a word meaning depth because of the rivers.
Oh, interesting.
Or the image the source paints of these once great Mayan cities now buried. Or even that idea that the tropical jungles were the world the Spanish actually found, not necessarily the high country they might have wanted.
Those specifics really give you a foothold, don't they? They hint at a history shaped by the land itself, long before the modern era.
Exactly. So using your document as our guide, let's begin where the story starts deep in the past, thousands of years ago.
Right.
Where do these sources say people first arrived?
Okay, so the PDF suggests the earliest inhabitants could have arrived maybe between 20,000 and 10,000 BC.
Wow, that far back.
Yeah, potentially via a land bridge from North America. It even mentions a theory that some Semitic-descended Mesoamericans might have migrated south, maybe fleeing the Olmecs in what's now Mexico.
Interesting. And the document makes it clear it wasn't just one group, right? It was diverse from the start.
Oh, far from it.
Yeah.
The source really highlights the incredible diversity of indigenous tribes. You've got the Lenca, Pech, Payas, Chortis, Tawaka, Tulupen, Jikak, Mosquito, Nahuas, and the Garifuna, too, noting their unique origins and cultures.
And when we think ancient Honduras, the Maya often spring to mind. What
Yeah.
does your source focus on there?
It zeroes in on the Mayan civilization's peak, sort of 5th to 9th centuries.
Yeah.
It emphasizes their really sophisticated achievements, especially at sites like Copan.
Copan, right?
Yeah, talking about monumental architecture, impressive water engineering, a complex writing system, astronomy, and just beautiful art. Stone, jade, basalt. The source really brings that cultural height to life.
But the PDF also points out a really key historical shift, doesn't it? Their decline.
Yes, and this is crucial. The source describes this mysterious decline by the 16th century. It mentions things like wars, plagues, maybe religious changes.
And the significance of that timing.
Well, the insight here is that this decline meant they were less formidable, to the Spanish when they arrived than they might have been centuries earlier.
Ah.
The source even includes that quite poignant comment from Bartolomé de las Casas, noted in your PDF, about their wisdom and art before the full impact of the conquest really hit.
That's striking, but the sources also make sure to note that not all indigenous cultures just vanished, right?
Exactly. That's a key point in the material. It explicitly mentions that intact Zapotec and Lenca cultures continue to flourish in isolated highlands even today. It highlights this thread of cultural survival through immense change.
And the document gives us glimpses into their world before Columbus, practices, beliefs. What stands out?
It mentions things like consulting waters and hills, describes sacrifices, and it uses quotes around the term, which is interesting.
Suggests a different context, maybe.
Possibly, yeah. Different from the European understanding. And rituals like the Acabal sunrise ceremony, the concept of the Nahual, like a divine counterpart. It shows a deep connection to the natural and spiritual world.
And the material you shared connects this ancient past directly to the cultural richness you still see today.
It strongly emphasizes that. Modern Honduras is multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural. It lists, I think, 6 indigenous languages still spoken. Lenca, Mosquito, Garifuna, Pech, Chortis, Nahuas.
Still spoken today.
Yeah. And it even notes an effort back in the early 80s to revive the Lenca language. The PDF highlights traditional festivals, too, as expressions of this culture, blending religious elements with, community display.
So you have this incredibly deep, diverse foundation built over thousands of years, and then, boom, everything changes with the Spanish arrival.
That shock of conquest is laid out really starkly in the source, yeah. It marks Columbus's arrival in 1502 on his fourth voyage. He named the area Las Cibueras.
But the actual sustained conquest, the campaign, that came a bit later.
Yes, starting in 1524. Figures like Hernán Cortés, Gil González Dávila. The document describes it as a brutal 14-year undertaking.
And the motivation was pretty clear.
Oh, yeah. The source is blunt. The search for gold, silver, and labor.
And the sources don't really sugarcoat how that went down.
And not at all. They detail brutal attacks, the kidnapping and enslavement of thousands of indigenous people. It led to, in some areas, a near eradication of the native population.
Wow.
The document acknowledges native resistance, defending territories, forming alliances, but it underscores the immense difficulty they faced against, well, a vastly different and ruthless military force.
And the source contrasts the stated goals of the Spanish with the reality on the ground.
Right. That ideal of a peaceful invasion or conversion versus the grim reality of forced adoption of Spanish culture, Christianity. It talks about early settlements like Trujillo being established but immediately facing challenges, indigenous revolts, French privateers.
So instability right from the beginning of the colonial period.
Pretty much. And the colonial economy shifted over time, too, according to the sources.
How so?
Well, it started with trade and agriculture, then moved to gold mining, though the source notes this actually created pretty limited wealth for the colony itself.
Okay.
Then it shifted to cash crops like indigo, and later logwood extraction. So shaping the economy around resource extraction, basically.
What about the social structure they imposed? What does the source say about that?
The PDF makes it clear, a strict hierarchy, Spaniards at the top.
Of course.
Followed by privileged mestizos, and then underprivileged Indians and blacks at the bottom. And the document highlights something important. The very pattern of exploiting native labor prevented them from acquiring Spanish or literacy.
Ah, so it was systematic.
It speaks to the systematic nature of the control, yeah. It even mentions official prohibitions against mixing between Indians and Spaniards, which the source implies was designed to maintain this hierarchy and control wealth.
And religion was obviously a major tool in all this.
Huge. The sources describe that initial clash of beliefs. Missionaries, soldiers, sailors, all involved in conversion efforts. Churches often built right on top of pagan sites.
Symbolism there?
Definitely. But the source also notes the limitations. Waning zeal among the Spanish, logistical problems meaning parishes lagged behind settlement, even priests quarreling among themselves or with officials.
And there's a particularly tragic detail about the timing of mass conversions.
Yes, the source points out this really tragic coincidence. The period of mass conversions in places like Gracias and Tegucigalpa, mid-1500s. It happened just as the Indian population there was being absolutely decimated by disease and violence.
That's haunting.
It really is.
Yeah.
A haunting connection the document makes. And then later, by 1747, the source notes that due to labor shortages, thousands of black slaves were brought in, adding another layer to this complex imposed society.
And just when you think the story is Spain versus the indigenous populations, the sources bring in another player.
Right, the English pirates, establishing settlements on the Bay Islands, Roatan, Utila in the 17th century.
Adding more conflict.
Exactly. The source points out this turned the whole region into a battleground between England and Spain, another dimension of external conflict piled onto an already turbulent colonial period.
Okay, so this whole history, ancient richness, violent conquest, exploitation, external conflict, it all kind of sets the stage for the next big struggle, independence. What does the source say sparked that movement?
The document describes this feeling of nothingness or maybe deep dissatisfaction that contributed to the independence movement. And after the Central American Federation dissolved, instability just came roaring back. The source mentions filibusters even invading in 1860.
And this is where figures like Francisco Morazán become really central, according to the source.
Yes, Morazán emerges as a key figure. The document talks about his rise becoming president by capitulation, apparently, and his goals, trying to end the constant revolutions, reduce the church's power.
But the sources paint a complex picture of him.
Very complex, even contradictory. The source calls him an eternal figure in one breath, but then it also refers to his troops as execrable, and even describes him as a murderous automaton in another part.
Wow, so the source itself presents these really different takes on him.
Exactly. It shows the complexity the document is grappling with in assessing his legacy. It's not straightforward.
And there are regional influences too?
Yeah, the source highlights the influence of other Latin American revolutions, and this regional Pacto de Asociación in 1855, where patriots across Central America kind of banded together.
Believing strength in numbers.
Yeah, believing that success in one country would help the others. The source even lists leaders from other Central American countries involved in that effort.
Did the document mention any periods of maybe relative progress early on?
There's a brief mention, yeah. Under President Santos Guardiola, the source notes he focused on public education, infrastructure, even sold state properties to fund schools, established a school of fine arts.
A glimmer, perhaps.
Yeah, a brief moment highlighted in the material, yeah. But the sources emphasize that the early formation of the Republic after 1827 was anything but smooth.
How so?
Well, while they set up structures like a Congress and provinces, the document states it was immediately plagued by political discord, conflicts like the Olancho annexation. There was this sense right from the start that the borders and political structures were kind of arbitrary, unstable.
And the source even hints at a longer history of governance predating the Republic.
That's an interesting little detail, yeah. The material mentions this concept of a first constitution for the Reino de Honduras, dating back to laws and customs from the 1600s.
From Spanish institutions.
Yeah, European and Hispanic institutions, suggesting a much older foundation of rule, even if the Republican structure itself was newer.
But despite that, the sources really detail a long, troubled history of political instability after independence.
Oh, this is a major theme. The document describes these relentless cycles: civil wars, foreign intervention, assassinations, disputed elections, and a whole series of military coups. It specifically lists 1963, 1972, 1975.
And the source highlights a particularly grim period under military rule.
It does. It points to the period under regimes like Paz Garcia's. The document states flatly that human rights violations then exceeded anything previously recorded.
Exceeded.
Yeah. Killings, torture, forced disappearances, death squads. The source even mentions military involvement in economic activities like agricultural enterprises. This section of the source is quite stark in its description.
What are the liberal reform period? Late 19th century, the sources mention economic changes then.
Right, roughly 1870 to 1890. The document notes state lands passing to foreign interests, financial institutions developing, some nascent industrialization.
Sounds like progress, maybe.
On the surface. But the sources say this also led to social and political decay, a fear among rural populations of losing their subsistence farming, and demographic shifts due to migration. So, economic change, yes, but not necessarily equitable or stable.
And all these centuries of internal conflict, external influence, they lead us directly to the modern challenges the sources describe.
Absolutely. Shifting into the 20th and 21st centuries, the sources are explicit. U.S. intervention has a deep and significant history here.
Going way back.
Yeah, starting late 19th century, modernization efforts, foreign companies, especially the banana companies.
The Banana Republic origin.
Exactly. And the source notes this led to bitterness against U.S. actions, particularly among the underprivileged classes.
And this involvement ramped up during the Cold War.
Significantly, yes. The source states the U.S. got heavily involved, helped establish military governments, used Honduras as a base of operations for its military ventures in the region.
And the human rights aspect?
This is critical. The document points out the U.S. supported these military regimes despite widespread human rights violations. It even mentions the impact of U.S. and Canadian companies, like Interfor, leading to PEC's dispossession and violence, and increased scrutiny of human rights abuses later on, partly influenced by events like El Mozote nearby.
The sources mentioned democracy was eventually restored, but the instability didn't just vanish.
No, democracy returned in 1982, but the document highlights persisting corruption, ongoing political violence. It details the coups, June 2009, against President Zelaya.
I remember that.
And then this February 2020 event, which the source calls the Hand-in-Hand Pact. And here's that really unique, quite shocking detail you mentioned earlier from the source.
The selling of presidential orders.
Yeah. The source states that after that 2020 event, presidential orders were clandestinely sold to a private company. It just paints a picture of how deep the institutional breakdown goes.
And this creates a climate of extreme violence that the sources describe as almost a defining feature of modern Honduras.
It really does. The documents state Honduras quickly became one of the most violent countries in the world. Parts ruled by gangs, extortionists, The source highlights this nation brand promoting a white race, which the material describes in really strong terms, calling it a type of genocide against poor and colored populations.
That's incredibly strong language from the source.
It is, and it notes the transformation of the historical Honduran left into what the sources call an openly narco-play and corrupt political project. These are very specific, very blunt observations from the material you provided.
And even the recent election of Xiomara Castro, the first female president, hasn't necessarily ended this entirely, according to the sources.
The source notes her unexpected election in 2021,
Yeah.
but it states that repression and political violence against the opposition continue, including the killing of journalists. The document specifically mentions Anthony Galdames, described as a strong critic of the administration who was kidnapped and brutally murdered.
So the cycle continues in some ways. What about the economy? Is the picture there similarly challenged?
Very much so. The sources talk about basically 2 decades of growth just being wiped out.
Wiped out. By what?
By the 2009 coup, the Great Recession hitting globally, and this extreme political turbulence domestically, GDP per capita fell significantly.
Does the source identify specific causes for this collapse?
Yes, it points to what it calls 3 off-the-charts external shocks: a critical institutional breakdown, climate change leading to micro-weather catastrophes, and extreme criminal violence.
A perfect storm, almost.
Pretty much. And it highlights that paradox for the mid-2000s. Stable growth was happening, but alongside really poor social and environmental indicators, suggesting the growth wasn't benefiting everyone or built on a stable foundation to begin with.
And the source describes a specific concerning economic model taking hold more recently in the 2010s.
Yes, it calls it an armed utilitarian militocracy.
Okay, what does that mean according to the source?
It describes a system where the military became a really powerful economic actor. The government fiercely privatized public goods, eliminated social ones, government debt surged. The source states the military even began owning land ahead of debt contracts.
Owning land?
Yeah, creating what the document terms criminally asymmetric growth, meaning growth that benefits criminals and elites at the expense of everyone else. And it notes violence was used against civil society members who opposed this direction.
Which brings us to the deep-seated social issues the sources describe. Poverty must be a major one.
Huge. The material highlights extremely high rates, 47.3% nationwide poverty, but a staggering 84% among children.
84%.
Yeah, and extreme poverty concentrated in rural areas, South and West especially, where income from cash crops like coffee is low, vulnerable to market shifts.
And the sources paint a picture of family life amidst this, the role of women.
They mention large families, many headed by single mothers, poor government services, infrastructure in rural areas. But the document emphasizes women's absolutely key roles in production, income generation, making decisions about health, education.
Despite the challenges.
Exactly. While noting that broader interventions to support families are often pretty limited in scope.
And layered on top of all this are natural disasters, which the sources mention as a constant threat.
Yeah. Presented as recurring crises. The document lists cyclones, hurricanes, tropical storms, earthquakes, all cause destruction, economic crises. It specifically mentions Hurricane Mitch in '98, devastating, and then Hurricanes Delta and Eta just recently in 2020.
And the impacts.
Shortages, inflation, layoffs.
Yeah.
The source details. It just shows how incredibly vulnerable the country is to these environmental shocks.
And the sources make a direct link between all these challenges, the disasters, the political violence, the criminal insecurity, and migration, right?
Explicitly so. The document connects this whole confluence of factors to the significant migration patterns we see, including the caravans of the migrant heading north.
Which got so much attention.
Yeah, and the source even notes the use of militarized police against these caravans.
And climate change is specifically highlighted as a driver, too.
Yes. The source mentions climate change impacts, specifically maize and bean crop failures, as a factor driving migration, especially among farming families and young people just leaving the education system. It adds another layer of environmental pressure, forcing people to move.
So finally, how do the sources frame Honduras's place in the wider world today?
Well, they note its diplomatic relations, participation in international bodies, UN, OAS, SICA, the Central American Common Market, things like that.
Standard international engagement.
Right. But they also starkly state its status, poorest country in Central America, and 4th poorest in Latin America, according to one index mentioned in the source.
And regionally. Is there cooperation?
Yes. It mentions regional partnerships, integration efforts, particularly with Guatemala and El Salvador, notes the U.S. is its main trading partner. And geographically, the document describes its unique position, this geographical bridge linking North and South America.
Which contributes to its biodiversity.
Exactly, immense biodiversity.
So, looking at all these threads woven together in the sources from those ancient foundations, through the brutality of conquest, the cycles of political turmoil and external influence, the economic struggles, social challenges, environmental vulnerability, what does seeing it all laid out like this make you consider?
Well, it really highlights the incredible complexity, doesn't it? And the deep, deep roots of the challenges the country faces today. It's not just modern issues. It's a history where powerful external forces and persistent internal divisions have shaped the landscape for centuries, creating the conditions the sources describe now.
It really underscores how interconnected everything is, how events from centuries ago seem to echo right into the present-day realities described in this PDF.
It's a history of resilience, for sure. You see that too. But it's also one where the systems of exploitation and instability laid down so early on have just proven incredibly difficult to overcome.
We've certainly taken a deep dive into the history of Honduras, guided by the source material you provided.
Yeah, we've seen the layers, that incredible cultural depth, the ancient achievements, the natural beauty, but also the profound impact of conquest, the struggle for independence, the relentless political instability, and the heavy weight of external influence.
These sources offer a powerful, often difficult, but ultimately vital picture, don't they? A nation shaped by such intense forces. They really connect those historical threads, the colonial structure, the coups, the interventions directly to the modern realities described. Poverty, migration, political turmoil, environmental vulnerability.
What really stands out is how the past isn't just prologue here. It feels like it's actively living in the present challenges described in these sources.
It definitely leaves you with a lot to think about. And maybe a final thought to consider, building on this history. Given this incredibly long story, where external forces and internal conflicts have so profoundly shaped everything, what paths forward are truly possible for Honduras?
That's the big question, isn't it? How can that deep cultural heritage, that unique ecological position we talked about, how can they intersect with the really urgent needs for stability, for security, for equitable development that this material lays so bare?
A complex question, absolutely. Build right out of the history you shared with us, something for you, the listener, to continue exploring and considering as you reflect on this deep dive.